The year 1798 was an interesting year in the period that was collectively referred to as the French Revolutionary Wars. The First Coalition had collapsed in 1797, and Britain was facing France all alone. With no threats on the continent, France was planning to split the British Empire by sending its greatest general to invade Egypt. But Napoleon's invasion of Egypt was not the only French invasion of 1798. On May 7th, in a little remembered battle, a vastly outnumbered force of British sailors and marines faced down a substantial French invasion force that could have been called a dress rehearsal for an invasion of the British Isles. The Battle of Îles Saint-Marcouf is an example of one of those brave stands where the few stood against the many. It is history that deserves to be remembered. A central British strategy during the French Revolutionary Wars was the blockade of France by the Royal Navy. Patrick Brazek of William Laurier University wrote in a 2017 edition of the Journal of Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Excellence that throughout the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain relied heavily upon its maritime forces, known collectively as the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's blockade of the European continent during this period thwarted Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions for the invasion of Great Britain, cut France off from its overseas resources, and facilitated England's rapid imperial and economic growth. However, Brazek explains that the blockade system was particularly challenging for the Royal Navy, which did not achieve true naval dominance until after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1815. The blockade, in fact, created numerous difficulties that, he writes, were only overcome by the skill of the Royal Navy's ablest admirals and captains. One significant problem was that blockading essentially kept the enemy ships in port, preventing the sort of large naval engagements like Trafalgar, where the advantage in Royal Navy training and gunnery might score a decisive victory. But the blockade strategy also offered more direct problems. The ships of the blockade were at sea for long periods, without the benefit of the supply and protection of a port. They were subject to the constant challenges of weather and the boredom of crews. Issues of life at sea, including harsh discipline, poor food, and lack of shore leave, had contributed to two failed mutinies among the Royal Navy crews in 1797. The blockade system, Brazek explains, was ruinous to the ships, hard on the morale of the seamen, and incredibly expensive. These problems were not lost on Royal Navy Captain Sidney Smith, in command of a squadron of frigates engaged in blockading the French coast from Cape Barfleur to Havre, an area that retired Royal Artillery Lieutenant Colonel M.E. Laws noted in a 1948 edition of the Journal of the Royal Artillery was roughly the area covered by the Allied invasion of June 1944. It occurred to Smith that an advanced base would help to facilitate his squadron's activities, and so looked to two small, uninhabited islands off the coast of Normandy, the Îles de Saint-Marcouf. The two islands, Île de Large and Île de Terre, had been a monastic retreat from around the 5th to the 15th century, and by legend Saint Marcouf, a Saxon monk associated with the conversion of the inhabitants of the Isle of Jersey, died there in the year 558, thus giving the islands their name. By the late 18th century, Laws writes, the islands represented two flat rocks, each about an acre in extent and 200 yards apart, lying some 3.5 miles from the French coast and about 9 miles southeast of Cape La Hogue. The London Evening Mail described them as being so insignificant as to not appear on any maps but those of the largest scale. In July of 1795, Smith occupied the islands, where he expected they could provide a partially safe anchorage for his frigates and small boats, as well as a base for smaller vessels that could be used to interdict French vessels trading too close to the shore for attack by his frigates. The size of the islands limited the size of a garrison, and defense, Laws notes, would depend chiefly on British command of the sea. Smith sacrificed some of his smaller vessels, bringing their cannon on shore and using their timbers to create defensive redoubts. The works were then improved by the Royal Engineers. Laws describes the defensive works as closed works surrounded by ditches, which had to be blasted out of the rock and had stone revetments. In addition, prefabricated wooden blockhouses were built on each island. The works were armed with what he calls a motley collection of cannon that had been taken from small naval vessels. The fortifications were focused on defending the narrow sound between the islands, which was used as an anchorage. The fortifications were manned by Royal Navy sailors, although naval historian William James noted in his 1847 Naval History of Britain, a great many of those were invalids, meaning men not fit for shipboard duty. Laws notes that the living conditions on these tiny rocky islands, only 18 feet above mean sea level, were very hard. Owing to difficulty with discipline and instances of desertion, small detachments of Royal Marines and Royal Artillery were brought to the islands, as well as some invalids of the regular army taken from the garrison on Jersey. Laws writes, the arrival of detachments of Royal Artillery, Royal Marines, and invalids seems to have had a steadying effect, for there was a notable decrease in desertion, and discipline improved, judging by the punishments entered in the captain's logs. Life on the island was not easy. Laws notes that the winter gales repeatedly blew away the improvised tents, and the sea frequently made clean sweep over the islands. The troops were supplied with provisions from Portsmouth, but water was always very strictly rationed. Naval historian Richard Woodman wrote in his book The Sea Warriors in 2001 that small cruisers were instructed to take sacks of earth and land them at Saint-Marcouf. By this means a garden was made which provided the garrisons and the sloops and gun brigs of the area with fresh vegetables. Attempts to raise cattle and chickens produced problems when the wandering livestock damaged the redoubts. The islands were under the command of the captain of one of the vessels defending the island, Charles Paps Price, in command of HMS Badger, which James describes as a cruiser-converted Dutch hoy, mounting 4 or at most 6 guns. Price was a veteran, but not necessarily in the best sense of the word, and that he had progressed slowly in command. Woodman writes, Price, commissioned in 1778, was an officer without interest, a coarse man who made the most of his unusual billet by bringing out his mistress, a Portsmouth whore, and keeping her openly on the island. Although the Leicester General describes him as a gentleman who has been from his youth in the constant service of the Navy and above 20 years a lieutenant. He is a veteran seaman, accustomed to disappointments and to overcome the difficulties of arduous stations. A second officer, Lieutenant Richard Bourne, captain of the similarly sized HMS Sandfly, was placed under Price and commanded the garrison on Île de Terre. Despite the conditions, the island proved valuable to the Navy. Laws writes that the launches and cutters from the islands continually raided the enemy coasters close inshore. There was an almost daily boat service engaged in landing and taking off French royalist messengers, and parties of 10 or more émigrés at the time passed in and out of France through Saint-Marcouf. The British frigates used the islands as an advanced base for their blockade of Havre, and a lookout on West Island was often able to give them early information as to the movements of enemy shipping. This did not go unnoticed by the French. The small garrison drew the attention of the ominously named French army, the Angleterre, or Army of England. James explains. Soon after his triumphant return from Italy, Bonaparte was appointed by the Directory the commander-in-chief of an army called, in a rather more public manner than would, we should suppose, have been the case, had there been anything but a diversion intended, Armée d'Angleterre. While ostensibly created from veteran units returning from fronts of the War of the First Coalition and intended for an invasion of England, Napoleon only stayed with the Armée d'Angleterre briefly before departing for Toulon, being replaced by Irish-born General Charles Kilmaine. Napoleon was, of course, planning for his Egyptian campaign, and James assumes that the Armée d'Angleterre mostly existed for the purpose of distracting from that campaign, writing that the army, whose very name, coupled with extravagant tales of its amount, was calculated, if not to create alarm, to cause many expensive preparations in the defensive way on the opposite side of the Channel. Still, the Armée d'Angleterre had resources. Historian Roger Morris of Exeter University explains in the 1997 book Nelson versus Napoleon that the serious threat of invasion began in 1797, inspired by Napoleon Bonaparte. From the autumn of 1797, all of the harbors along the coast from Antwerp to Cherbourg began rapidly filling with gun vessels and flat-bottomed boats for the invasion of England. The flat-bottom landing boats, which were built in the hundreds for the commission, were popularly known as Muskegon boats, after the Antwerper who had produced their plans. Laws describes these flat-bottom boats. Each carried an 18-pounder and a 6-pounder, with about 130 soldiers as well as a crew of 15 sailors. Woodman writes that it was an affront to French honor that these islands remained in British hands, supporting the blockade of the French Channel, ports from La Hogue to Le Havre, and Laws explains that early in 1798 the French authorities decided to make a serious attack on the islands, either because the garrison had become an intolerable nuisance, or perhaps in order to focus British attention on the Channel at a time when Napoleon was sailing from Toulon on the secret expedition, which eventually took him to Malta and Egypt. It was possible that an attack on Saint-Marcouf might confirm the rumors then in circulation that Bonaparte's objective was England, or more probably, Ireland. But the goal was also clearly as a dress rehearsal for an eventual invasion of the United Kingdom. Woodman explains that in April 1798, determined to prove his craft, Muskegon had himself appointed to lead an invasion force against Saint-Marcouf. While Morris writes that, as the boats and the seamen and soldiers who were intended to man them gathered in the ports, it occurred to someone that they might be used to clear up a local annoyance while obtaining experience and a small taste of action. Muskegon himself planned to lead the attack, assembling a fleet of some 50 Muskegon barges and several shallow-draft brig corvettes, which Laws describes as powerfully armed craft, carrying each 2 or 3 heavy guns, usually 24-pounders and 18-pounders, with some 36-pounders. However, in April, as he tried to move his fleet, he ran into the Royal Navy, the frigates HMS Diamond and Hydra, and the 50-gun fourth-rate ship HMS Adamant. Musquet was able to escape after Diamond briefly ran aground. The French fleet eventually made it to safe harbor in La Hogue, where, Morris writes, he lay awaiting calm weather in order to attack Lieutenant Price. Morris continues, his opportunity came on the night of 6 May. The British had warned of his approach, but there was a dead calm, and the Adamant, Eurydice, and the sloop Orestes, the only warships in the area, could not get near the islands to help in their defense. In the darkness, the French placed themselves to attack at dawn. The attack was coming towards Price on Ile de Large, and the British fleet sat becalmed, too far away to intervene. Laws writes that the British garrison had received ample warning of impending attack and had devoted much time to exercising the guns and practicing beating to quarters. 2 days before the French attack, the garrison was reinforced by Royal Marines and seamen from ships on the station. The defenses of both islands had been strengthened by the construction of chevaux de frise, wooden obstacles, at possible landing places, by the building of obstacles, and by a floating boom moored offshore to prevent the approach of boats. Still, the odds were long. Laws writes that Price had available his 50 sailors from USS Badger, 125 Marines of all ranks, and a Royal Artillery detachment of 9 men and 1 sergeant. They had mounted 14 heavy guns, 2 68-pounders, 2 32-pounders, 6 24-pounders, 3 24-pounder carronades, 1 24-pounder howitzer, besides over a dozen 6-pounders and 4-pounders, although other historians give slightly different numbers of artillery pieces. Musquet's force included some 57 vessels, 50 landing barges, and 7 brig corvettes. Woodman writes that counting the heavy guns and the leading barges and the broadsides mounted by the brig corvettes, the enemy were able to bring about 80 guns to bear on the defenses. The barges carried between 5,000 and 6,000 troops under the command of General Francois Point. Morris writes that at daybreak on the 7th, the French brigs were seen at about 350 yards from the British fortifications. The guns, which would bear on them, opened fire. The French replied vigorously, and their landing craft advanced with great determination to land their men. Price reported that I observed their line drawn west of the southwest face of the western redoubt, and having all guns I could bring to bear well pointed, I began a steady, well-directed fire on them. He said he observed 6 or 7 of them go down. I'm clear from the crowded state of their decks that they have received great damage and slaughter. Woodman writes, as the French rowed boldly inshore, the British guns sank half a dozen flat boats before they made the beach, which deterred the others, while British Marines kept up a galling fire from the shore. Morris writes, but the effect of the sinking of 6 or 7 of these laden boats caused the others to change their mind and withdraw. The flats had proven exceptionally vulnerable to British guns. The Leicester Journal reported that the carnage on the enemy was very considerable. We have accounts from the coast this morning which state the loss to have been 1,200 men. The decks and boards that have floated from the sunken vessels are dyed with the blood of the sufferers. Could have been even worse for the French. As the Chester Chronicle noted, had not Sir Richard's squadron been prevented from acting by a calm, it is probable that not one boat would have got back to inform the great nation of the issue of this petty invasion. As to Price's losses, he reported, I'm sorry to announce the death of Thomas Hall, private, Marine, killed. Richard Dunn and Peter Williamson, Marines, wounded, and Thomas Banks, seaman, wounded. But considering our receiving fire of nearly 80 heavy guns from 36 to 18 pounders for upwards of 2 hours, I look upon our damage as not great. To be sure, the defenses were as prepared as they could be. Morris writes of the outcome, opposed landing is always one of the most difficult actions of war, and the combination of well-prepared defenders and strong fortifications on shore made up for the imbalance of numbers. Also, the French seem to have had more enthusiasm and bravery than skill and training. Noting that the Saint-Marcouf garrison continued to act as an advance base for the blockades of the French coast and was not again seriously attacked. Laws writes that a British garrison should have been maintained for nearly 7 years, less than 4 miles from the enemy's coast, is a remarkable illustration of the supremacy of British sea power. The repulse of the French attack in May 1798 was indeed a very gallant achievement, and provided one of the comparatively rare instances of British success in coast defense during the Napoleonic Wars. But Saint-Marcouf has long been entirely forgotten. If a Hollywood movie presented a battle with such a lopsided outcome, you would probably think them silly. History is often stranger than fiction. After languishing so long without promotion, Price was promoted to Master and Commander after the battle, which was widely publicized in Britain. He even stayed in the Navy long enough to achieve the rank of Post Captain. Britain gave the Îles Saint-Marcouf back to France at the end of the War of the Second Coalition in the 1802 Treaty of Amiens. The islands briefly made the news again in 1944 when they became the first French soil to be liberated in the D-Day invasion. Today they are a bird sanctuary. As to the battle, Morris opines, this gives a fair idea of the probable result had the invasion of Britain been attempted. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.